Hi, this is Sapphire Ed, and welcome to the Sapphire Nation Podcast 2.4. We'll tell you all about that joke later. My guest is Wendell Wilson of Level 1 Tech. Wendell, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going? Glad to be here.
It's going well. Wendell had just given us an explanation of why his channel exists, what he wants to do of sharing his enthusiasm. I'm trying to cut to the chase because God bless the poor listeners that are in here with us that have heard that for 4 times now. Okay, Wendell, the topic at hand for us is Linux gaming. So let's dive into Linux gaming and let's spend some time talking about it. I guess the first question, now we're going to do this in a very simplified manner. I know a lot of you listening are tech enthusiasts and maybe even have a lot of Linux experience. Assume this is for everybody else. So let's begin with, why would somebody choose Linux over Windows as an operating system?
Linux really gives you an unprecedented level of access to what's going on. Like an operating system, it's huge. There's an operating system is like a program. You think about your USB installer. It fills up an 8 gigabyte, USB installer. 8 gigabytes of information. That is an insane amount of information. The collected works of Shakespeare is only 1.5 meg. And it's like, what's going on under the hood with this? Well, Linux, you can sort of see under the hood. You can do nuts and bolts. You can tune. Linux generally will run better on older hardware or on lesser hardware. And, gaming is not something that historically Linux has done super well at because, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. But in terms of having a very nice experience computationally and being able to have access to exactly what your computer is doing under the hood, Linux is pretty nice. It's robust, it's reliable, and as somebody who's been using Linux since the late 90s, there are preferences and files that I created in the late 90s that I still have. And if you were to try to bring forward your Windows 3.1 preferences
done that
to Windows 10, yeah, that ain't happening.
So Linux has got an older backward compatibility. It's got a much smaller footprint. Understood that. But does it really bring any advantage to the gamer?
It will, probably. It probably, well, I think that Linux is going to have, how sometimes you want to play an older game and it just doesn't run really well at all.
Yep.
And then you got to haul out DOSBox. I mean, good old games, some of the really old games will actually not run at all on a modern system, and you end up having to run it in DOSBox or something like that. The same is kind of true. Like, you can run into those kind of problems on Linux as well, just because you have something that's older, that's maybe not as good or whatever. But because it's open source, if there's enough interest, if there's enough people that want to use that or want to really improve compatibility, they'll bring it forward, and it'll actually run really well. And so something really interesting happened. There's a system from Valve. Valve is supporting sort of cross-platform play on Linux.
Right.
It's actually getting to be quite good. Lutris and DXVK and some of the other things. And DXVK is a translation layer. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but DXVK is something that was created to help Linux game better. But it's a DirectX to Vulkan translation layer. And Vulkan is one of the ways that Doom Eternal, I think it's Doom Eternal, is doing such incredible things with what they're doing, so a new modern API. Well, that older DirectX to Vulkan translation layer, it turns out it's also handy on Windows. So some people have been able to get older DirectX titles working much better on Windows with Vulkan, even way after the studio and all the programmers are gone.
Well, that's interesting. Now, what about the problems, though, that exist? Well, actually, I'm going to rephrase that. Are there problems? Is it more difficult to update drivers, to keep a system up to date, or is it easier because it doesn't have to update as often? I mean, how does that play in? That's one of the complaints in Windows, always needing to update drivers.
Generally, once your system is stable on Linux, you don't have to update nearly as often. Although, especially with AMD GPUs, things are developing so rapidly that you do actually benefit from trying to keep your system a little bit more up to date. There's this idea of a rolling release on Linux where you just sort of get the updates as they're ready. Like Manjaro is one of the ones that sort of came there. And Manjaro sort of, was in the background. It's like Ubuntu and, the perfectly stable, distribution, and you can do the long-term support, and that's good for 5 years. But then sort of Manjaro came to the forefront in the last year or two, or at least people started noticing that it was actually really good for gaming, even though it's kind of bleeding edge, because it received continuous updates and because companies like AMD were dumping so much time and resources into developing their open GPU drivers. And because of that, we saw vast and dramatic improvement on Linux gaming support, and also from Valve. So between Valve and AMD dumping a ton of time and resources into supporting gaming on Linux, you gotta sort, Valve, Gabe Newell, smart guy, sort of sees the writing on the wall that, maybe Microsoft is not really all about making Windows the best gaming experience for game developers. And it's like Gabe Newell's spending an awful lot of money to develop Linux into a proper gaming platform. What does he know that we don't?
Well, there is that consideration. I mean, I've been critical of Steam in the past because I felt like they spent all their money developing into Linux instead of, well, updating the Steam store, giving us a better GUI. So I guess there's something to be said with that. When this is something I've seen, and I've heard others comment on this. I wanted to hear your thoughts. Linux feels like a throwback to the DOS days. There seems to be a lot of command line that has to be used to effectively use Linux. Is that true?
I think that was probably true at one time. It's less true today than it has been historically, because of desktop environments like GNOME and KDE. The developers that have developed those desktop environments have really put a lot of work into it. But the interesting thing is that, coming from the other side, Microsoft and other companies have been putting a lot of work into making Windows more command line. The nice thing about the command line is that it is a repeatable procedure, and so it's a blessing and a curse. It's a gift and a curse, because we can bring up a terminal and you can type in a series of commands, and if you're writing a tutorial, the tutorial writer can be assured that if somebody can copy paste, surely they can copy paste, then their system is going to be in a defined state, and that's maybe a little easier than a series of images where it's like click this button and do this and drag this over here and now delete this and go here and up, and it sort of visually explains things to you. But also, if you have more than one system you have to manage, the command line is easier.
Well, what you're talking about, though, a lot of this, it sounds like, is from a very technical level point of view, from the point of view of a system administrator or somebody that is really deep in the weeds as a tech enthusiast. Linux is offering a lot. But what about that average gamer that doesn't want to know how his computer works? He wants to go in and play a game and be done. I
think that from the last year or two, you can install most of the major distros, Ubuntu and Manjaro and Pop! OS, and install Steam and install the game without ever hitting a command line. Totally out of the box experience. You're basically good to go. You do have to sort of carefully choose your hardware a little bit. So like, depending on what kind of a graphics card you get, or a couple other things, it might not work exactly perfectly out of the box. Before you install Steam, you might have to install an update, or you might have to download a proprietary driver or something. But once you do that, then you can install Steam and install a game. Point and click. You never have to hit the terminal.
Now, you just made an interesting point in what you said that I want to come back to. When you look at Windows, you look at Windows 10, you look at Windows 8, you look at Windows 7 and various updates, but essentially 3 versions of Windows as viable right now. With Linux, when we say Linux, we're not talking about one operating system. We're talking about how many different distributions are there?
Oh, how many grains of sand are there in the desert?
Oh my. Okay.
How many drops in the ocean?
How do you choose then? What's the best for the average gamer? What's the best distribution for them to go look for? Here we go.
It's very, very subjective. You can come to the level 1 forums or watch level 1 videos and learn a little bit more about it. I think if you obviously if you're listening to this podcast, you're at least a little bit of an enthusiast. You're not really afraid to get your hands dirty a little bit. Manjaro is not a terrible choice. It's a little more technical. It sort of pushes the envelope a little bit more. It doesn't really have the kid gloves necessarily. It can be point and click. Pop OS is another, and it's sort of a different. It's based on Ubuntu, and it's got System 76's special flavor with it. But System 76 has put a lot of work into making it even easier to be up and running with your hardware and point and click and ready to install Steam and things like that. But also even things like good old games. There's a ton of Linux support for some of those older games, and it is mostly a point and click experience there as well. So if you have a second machine or a machine that you can experiment with, either one of those you won't really go wrong. But if you want to do like a dual boot type situation, give it a try. There's not really a lot of risk and danger in doing that, especially if you get like a second hard drive, like just another small hard drive or another small SSD. Unplug your main hard drive if you're worried about it, and then set up Linux on the second hard drive and just take it for a spin. You'd be surprised. You probably will like it.
Well, this is an interesting idea, because you've got a lot of people, especially in the U.S., with they're using their COVID checks to build new PCs. Who knew that COVID would be good for PC gaming in any way? But you've got a lot of people building new PCs, and they've got their old PCs. Now, my daughter, in fact, is getting ready to build a new PC, and we were talking about using her old PC, different things to use it for, to even sell it. For the sound of it, this might be a good way to use it if you've never tinkered and want to try. Take that old PC, load up Linux, and take it for a spin.
Yeah. I mean, it really is like if you're a computer enthusiast, once you connect with Linux, it's hard to describe. It's almost like a religious experience, because you feel a lot closer to the machine. You feel a lot closer to the hardware. You have a better understanding of exactly what sort of black magic it is that's powering modern machines. And, whether you want to just do that for gaming, that's fine. But if you want to do anything computer related for your career, it will serve you well in your career to have a better understanding of how all that stuff works.
Okay, that's very cool. Talking about distributions, let's talk about the elephant in the room real quick before we move to the next topic of this. SteamOS. Is it a decent Linux implementation for a gamer, or are they better looking at these other implementations?
They would be much better looking at these other implementations. SteamOS is basically dead. And you gotta, whenever anybody wants to talk about or asks about SteamOS, you gotta understand the context of SteamOS. Gabe Newell went to Microsoft. It's like when Nixon went to China.
Just a second. Okay, so everybody is saying they're having some trouble hearing you in Discord.
I can give you some more gain.
If you could give us some more gain, we would appreciate it. Guys, if you need to, in Discord, right click on Wendell's name, and you can select to raise his volume.
Is that more better?
I would imagine that's more better for everybody.
Woo!
I'm going to go deaf, but that's okay. Is that better for everybody else? Is everybody else hearing Wendell better now? I will edit this in the recording. I can change some levels in the recording for everyone. But
I'm recording for you at time index 14 minutes in my recording.
Yeah, same here. And I may need your recording before this is done. Oh, dear God. Fine. I don't know what's going on with Audition. That's really weird. Okay, they say they can hear him perfectly. So it's different people at different volume levels. Guys, you can control the user volume for the individual user. In Discord, you can raise it. So, and you can lower mine. If I'm too loud for you, you can lower mine. So there are ways around this. Okay, so SteamOS, okay. It's an okay Linux distribution then for gaming?
No, I would probably stay away from it. Actually,
Okay.
it's not really getting the updates that it should, and that kind of thing. But SteamOS, the thing to keep in mind with SteamOS is that why did Steam do SteamOS? Like what possessed them? Gabe Newell went to Microsoft. It's like when Nixon went to China, and he was like, "I'm going to go in to Microsoft and I'm going to make the argument for gamers." Like it was almost like he was really low key about it, but like if you follow Gabe Newell and some of the people inside Valve, it was really just like, this is going to be great. We're Valve. We're a very large and wealthy company. We got Microsoft's ear. We're going to come together. We're going to do this amazing thing for gamers. It's going to be great. And then Gabe Newell went to China, went to Microsoft, and then he came back and he's like, they want nothing to do with this. This is really bad. And that was around the time of Windows 8 and Microsoft. It seemed to me, like without really throwing Microsoft under the bus, it seemed to me that Gabe Newell was basically telling the community, look, Microsoft wants to see all gaming on consoles. They do not want to see PC gaming. They don't think that PC gaming has a future on Windows. They're not really doing anything to update their APIs properly, blah, blah, blah. We're going to do it ourselves. And that was kind of true. Like from Windows 8, you think about like DirectX 12 and Vulkan. Like Vulkan was like, you never want somebody outside the operating system to have to like come up with the API for the graphic subsystem. Like the people developing the operating system kind of need to be involved in that. The people working on the kernel kind of need to be involved on that.
Yeah.
And after Windows 8.1, we got SteamOS. But then, because of the stuff in SteamOS, things improved dramatically. But it still wasn't enough for Valve. Valve needed that learning more than they needed that learning and experience for the Linux stuff more than they really needed to release a distro. So they released a distro, but releasing the distro, going to the moon was great, but it gave us Teflon and Gorilla Glass and all these other sort of ancillary things. And that's sort of what happened with SteamOS. Indirectly, it's given us things like Lutris and Proton and DXVK, the DirectX translation layer. And a lot of that has been funded in part or in whole by Valve. And because of that, every Linux distro can have really good Linux gaming. And so SteamOS is less important because those kinds of tweaks and features and stuff can make their way to other distributions like Manjaro and Pop! OS and your favorite distro.
So SteamOS is basically the developer bit.
Yeah, it was, and I don't think it's being as well maintained as it was when it was first released. And it was also like Valve had in mind that they could do consoles, they could offer quote unquote consoles with SteamOS, and that sort of petered out.
Oh God, yeah, that was a bad idea. I I I I don't know how many of our listeners remember that, but I remember watching when they introduced the Steam console, and I thought, man, this is just a really overpriced PC, is all it is. And it was sad. Um, you mentioned a bit back being picky about hardware. I have heard a lot of reviewers comment that AMD is better in Linux than NVIDIA. Is that actually true?
The um the reason most reviewers say that is because AMD's GPU driver is mostly pretty much open. You need a little bit of a binary blob to sort of bootstrap the card, and it's like a firmware interface for the card. But by and large, AMD is doing amazing work in the community. It's a fully open driver, it's pretty well supported, and a lot of people from the community have fixed problems in the open driver, which is really great. With NVIDIA, there is an open source NVIDIA driver, and it's called Nouveau, and it's not terrible. I don't want to sort of crap on it, but it's not really meant for gaming, and the performance is not great. NVIDIA has a proprietary Linux driver, so you can use NVIDIA cards on Linux, but NVIDIA doesn't keep up with like the bleedingest edge version of the Linux kernel, and sometimes it can be a little problematic when you go to update your system. Then it's like, oh, can I even update my system? Am I waiting on the NVIDIA driver to be updated? And sometimes they don't test older cards, so you got a useful lifetime of perhaps not as long with Team Green as you do with Team Red. And that said, sometimes AMD creates problematic situations too as well. Like when the RX 5700 launched, there were closed source Linux drivers, but it was a little problematic to support that on the Linux kernel side. Generally speaking, if you have an AMD card, you're going to have an easier plug and play experience with Linux than you will with other distros. But distros like Ubuntu as of 20.04 and Pop OS 20.0 19 point something and 20.04 and Manjaro have gotten permission from NVIDIA to include binary drivers or to include the functionality to be able to download binary drivers right from the installer. So when you first set up your system, whatever your card you have in there, it tries to figure out what you need to do and do it for you. So it's less of an issue than it has been. But generally, in the Linux community, you like to support the companies that are doing things fully open, and that's definitely AMD.
All right. So, is there other hardware that you need to be picky about when building a Linux system for gaming?
Not really. Sometimes you get into like USB controllers. Like sometimes your USB 3.1 Gen 2 controller might not be well supported. So it's like, oh, I happen to have my keyboard plugged into one of those like 10 gigabit ports. Yeah, don't do that. Sometimes you run into trouble with like a sound card, depending on what the implementation of the sound card is. The outputs of the sound card might not be labeled correctly, but generally like processor, storage, those kind of things, not a problem.
Okay, so let's get out of the weeds again for a second. Let's break this down real quick, and then we'll move on to questions and other topics. At the end of the day, new gamers that want to build a brand new system, they've never had a PC or a brand new system. Yes or no, Linux a good approach, or should they look at Windows?
Linux can be a perfectly fine experience, but if their friends are all playing Fortnite, they're going to have a bad time if they try to go pure Linux.
But somebody who's got a spare system wants to learn to tinker, Linux is a good idea. It's going to be fun.
Hopefully. Yeah, it's going to be fun, and you're going to level up your skills.
I lost you.
It's going to be fun, and you're going to level up your skills.
I mean, I literally just completely lost you in audio.
There's no...
Hold on. Is that why? No.
Hello?
Try it again, Wendell. I've lost all my audio. I can't believe this.
If you can hear me, say shillelagh.
This is crazy. Hold on for a second, folks. There it just came back. That is just crazy. I just lost all audio for a second.
That's weird.
That is. This has been the show from hell. It's like, it's like, and my boss is listening, by the way, while we're doing this. This has just been the show from hell. But live. This is the fun of live. Okay.
It's because it's because I'm connected from Linux. It's like, oh no,
you did this. You screwed us up with Linux. See what you did? Okay, we're back up running again now. Let's move on to some other topics. Because I know you do this. I'm going to give you a little chance to plug something you do. I've been looking at, a lot of people like to multi-monitor systems. I'm not a big fan of multi-monitoring, but I like to multi-system. And there is a device that's making a comeback, it seems, in the industry, the KVM switch. And I know you make...
Yes. We have a... Yeah, no, it's pretty nice.
Explain to people what a KVM switch is.
So, I've got an Asus, XG438Q. It's a 43-inch, 120 hertz, 4K monitor. It's pretty good. The most annoying thing with this monitor is the text is not super sharp when you're running it at 100% scaling at 4K, which absolutely drives me insane. But that's kind of a nice monitor. I don't want to buy multiple monitors. And I have multiple systems at my desk. And so I want to be able to switch between multiple computers with this 4K 120 hertz monitor. Let's DisplayPort 1.4. So we just came out with a KVM that supports DisplayPort 1.4. You can switch between two computers. And so you basically just have a switch box on your desk with a button that you hit, and it physically moves the monitor from one computer to the other computer. So I don't have to have, I don't have to have more than one monitor. It also has USB ports. So if we get a USB keyboard and mouse, or USB keyboard mouse and like an audio device or whatever, I can move that between devices. And it supports USB 2 and 3, which is not it's not unheard of in the KVM world, but most KVMs are made for like switching servers, so it doesn't really support high resolution or high refresh rate or FreeSync or G-Sync or anything like that. And the KVM will do all of those things.
Well, now, as a gamer, is there any glitches with using this kind of a software? Does this, or hardware? Does this create a potential problem?
Mostly no. You get into sometimes because there's no amplifier in the KVM. If you've got long cables, or the output of your particular video card is marginal, then you might have to use short cables or a repeater or an amplifier or something like that. But generally, there's not really a downside. The computer does know when you switch monitors. So, like if you're in the middle of a game and you switch displays, it'll think that you unplugged the monitor, and so you don't really want to do that. But otherwise, it's there's no mechanical moving of cables, so it's pretty nice.
Well, if the monitor gets unplugged as far as the game's concerned, that's going to create a problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, now what about just okay? I'm going to change the vernacular. I'm not sure if this exists. What about just a KM switch, keyboard and mouse? Do those exist?
Those kind of exist, but they're a little flaky most of the time, and most of the time they're only USB 2. So they don't do USB 2 and 3.
What about the software solutions? Like what's the one out of what is it? Microsoft's Garage or something?
Oh yeah, Garage Mouse from Microsoft. Yeah. You can sort of install software on your different computers and move your mouse between computers. So that's if you have multiple monitors set up on your desk and you just want to have one keyboard and mouse. When you move the cursor to the edge of a monitor, it'll actually go onto another computer, and that's doing stuff over the network. That's also not great in gaming because depending on how the game traps the mouse cursor, it might not realize that the mouse cursor can travel off the side of the screen. So, like Doom 2016, for example, I don't think this has been patched in Doom 2016. If you're using Garage Mouse or one of the other pieces of software, you have to hit a shortcut key to explicitly trap the mouse on the monitor that it's on.
I've seen that.
If you don't, you end up, controlling the other computer and the game, and it's like, oh, that's not good.
Yeah, but it would seem like that would be a cool thing for so that even though they've got a second PC and they could mount the monitors so they could see them both but control it from one keyboard and mouse. It would seem like a simplified solution.
Yeah, we have a lot of streamers that are using the KVM actually, because they'll just switch to the streaming computer for streaming and then switch back. And we had so many streamers using the KVM that there's another device that I sort of put together from stuff that I could sort of get and do that. And that's a splitter that is DisplayPort pass through with HDMI bleed off. And so this is really cool. This is another thing that's on the level 1 store. Is
Okay.
it's a DisplayPort input and a DisplayPort output. It'll do 4K 60 hertz. It's DisplayPort 1.2. It's not DisplayPort 1.4, so it can't do 4K 120 hertz. I'm working on that, but that won't be ready for a while. But the 4K 60 hertz, or 1440p 140 hertz, or 200 hertz at 1080p, it'll do those.
Right.
But it also gives you HDMI out, so you get the really awesome low latency magical happiness of DisplayPort. But then you also have an HDMI out that you can take into an HDMI capture card, like a USB HDMI capture card that might not have, monitor in and out, or PCIe HDMI capture card or whatever. And because you've got the HDMI out, that's what you use for streaming if you have a second PC streaming setup or whatever. But you don't have to have a capture card that explicitly has pass through, and you don't have to use HDMI for gaming, which is maybe not as good as DisplayPort in some scenarios.
Interesting. See, there's all sorts of cool tech out there for gamers. I think sometimes we get so focused on CPUs, GPUs, keyboards, mice. Well, actually, I don't think sometimes we focus enough on keyboards and mice. But we forget there are other cool technologies. And as more people want to stream, some of that cool technology really comes into play.
Not just streaming, but the other thing or it's kind of related to streaming. The other thing that I wanted to test is like benchmarking a game, but I want to benchmark the game not with software. I actually want to do some kind of hardware pass through, but I also want to connect it to a good monitor. And so that little splitter thing with HDMI out means that I can send the HDMI output of that to something like the Atomos 4K recorder, and if I'm using like FCAT, which puts the color bars on the side, now I have a piece of hardware that can losslessly capture video from a game benchmark and sort of reconstruct what the frame rate and frame times were from the display side of it. So it's not even a software side thing.
Nice.
I'm still working on that though.
See, that's one of the reasons I like talking to you. You don't just talk about the technology, you actually dive in and and still do what we used to do back in the day with solder irons and capacitors and and try to build something cool. That's been lost as an art, I think, in the PC world today.
Yeah, yeah. I think there is one review group that does the really amazing frame capture frame time stuff. Um and I'm drawing a blank on their name, but I watch their videos and their stuff, and they do the color bar capture thing, and that actually works really well.
All right, so we're going to open this up to everybody for questions. Again, I'd like to thank you all for your patience with the mess I've had today with the tech. I don't know what happened. This worked super smooth yesterday, or not yesterday, but the last show we did, and now it's just been a nightmare. And I honestly don't understand why. All the settings are technically the same.
It's Linux.
You and I will talk after we're done here because I may want to grab your recording
Yeah, that's fine.
and be able to play with it. Guys, give us some of your questions or thoughts, anything to do with technology. Wendell, Wendell makes me feel like a village idiot when it comes to technology. And I've always considered myself fairly technically educated. So we'll see what people have got. I scrolled back up a little bit through some of these. Most of these we've already covered. I do have a question. How does Linux become more mainstream gaming? You look at Steam right now, and I know the Steam survey has got pitfalls. It's not 100% accurate. But at this point, Linux is, well, Apple has 4 times as many users as Linux, according to this. How do you make Linux from a gamer's perspective more mainstream, do you think?
You keep adding more people that have Linux and that use Linux. I mean, there's I've got a Quake 3 Arena 10 box from I think 1999 or 98, 99,
Oh,
somewhere
good
through there.
Lord.
And that's the Linux edition of that game. And so like that's 20 years old, and that was one of the first like really commercial games for Linux from id Software. And the graphic stack then was completely different than it is now. So it's not the thing that will make Linux gaming relevant is more butts in the seats with Linux. I mean, that's really all it is. Um, if you have users, everything else will come. The companies will add support to it, and it will be a better experience. For some games right now today, gaming with those games on Linux is generally a better experience than it is on Windows. That's almost universally, not the case for a whole bunch of Windows games, and especially like AAA titles. So you think like with Doom Eternal, there's a little bit of a controversy right now because when it came out, it was basically not really DRM free. Well, I think it might have been DRM free, and it was fine. But now they've added de novo and a kernel driver to try to detect people cheating because they're going to, I think, add online play or something like that. Something like that is not going to fly on Linux, and because the Linux uh, respects the user,
Okay.
it would probably be the best way to explain it. And on Windows, that's just not the case. On Windows, that's never been the case. 15 years ago, Sony had music CDs that if you put them in the computer, it would install software to prevent you from
I
trying
remember that.
to make backup copies of music CDs. And it's like, this is not the computer. It's like, I own the computer. You're not allowed to make those kind of changes to my computer. I'm not allowing you to do that. They were doing it surreptitiously. Linux will not tolerate those kinds of things, whereas Microsoft might say, you know what? There's a lot of money here. All right, that's fine.
Yeah, but to some level, I understand. Standard protection, I understand to some level, though I'm not a fan of it. Anti-cheat software, that's actually fairly new. That's not something that's been around for all of gaming. And you have to wonder, at what point is it the community's fault that it allows the cheaters? And well, what I mean by allows the cheaters is tolerate them. For example, and I've been part of gaming groups where this has happened. If you're part of a gaming group and you find one of the guys in the group is using an aim bot or some other bot that gives him a huge advantage in the groups I've been, that person's out. The minute they're caught, they're out. And there's no oops, I made a mistake. There is, you're out, because it's talked about a lot. People don't do that. But then you've got many gaming groups that either will slap them on the wrist or completely ignore it. It feels like we as a community have become more tolerant of cheating.
Yeah, the community should not be tolerant of cheating for sure. But I don't think that preventing cheating in a particular game requires you to basically give up your machine or give up, because you don't know what that rootkit's doing. In the case of the Sony rootkit, it actually opened up, it made the computer less secure overall. And so, yeah, it's bad, but the community's never going to be able to do that on their own. But that is part of it.
I'm not saying that anti-cheat softwares are the solution, but I understand at least why they're done. Because the last thing you want, and to me, there's a level here that I'm amazed people don't get this in gaming. So if you've got a solo play game and you want to cheat in your solo play game, the only person affected is you. Okay, you're not hurting anyone else. You're not ruining anyone else's fun. It's just you. And if you want to download game cheats to cheat your solo play game, more power to you. I don't care.
Yeah.
But when you come to a multiplayer game, when you come to a game that you affect the fun and enjoyment of others, and your cheat takes that away from them, I think that starts to become a huge deal. And in those cases, I not only understand anti-cheat, I actually think they're a good idea. I don't want my game ruined because somebody wanted to cheat.
Yeah, and I think that there are ways that the anti-cheat can be built without having to be that invasive. And anti-cheat will always be needed because you'll always have somebody gaming the system in some way. There's just too much of a, there's too much of a drive. It's like, no, I have to be the best, or no, I have to do this, or no, I have to have this. And it's like, yes, there's a market for it, I guess.
As long as there's a market, it'll exist.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think that, to me, those kinds of, it's like I need a rootkit to do that. That's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's just like, nah, you know what? I don't need to play your game.
Well, I don't disagree. I think a rootkit, I think anything that becomes constantly active on your system is wrong. If it's active when that game is active, I've got a lot less animosity toward it. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, I know a lot of people hate these. I'm okay with games that if you run any mod, they won't let the game run in multiplayer.
Yeah.
Because you don't know if it was a cheat or not. A lot of mods are just cheats at the end of the day. I mean, we don't want to admit that, but it's true. Okay. A mod that gives you a bigger gun, mods that don't exist in the game. These are all cheats.
Yep.
So it's a tough place to be right now in the gaming industry to figure that out as multiplayer continues to grow, and you get more and more games with massive multiplayer opportunities. I kind of feel sorry for game developers. They're between a rock and a hard place. How do we make our games where people don't cheat, and how do we make our games where they're not intrusive with the software?
Yeah, well,
but there we go. There's another topic.
That's the market that's really created.
The people on Discord are being very focused. Usually, I'll do this, and questions are in 1,000 directions. They're very focused.
Well, that's the Linux.
Wendell, do you have a specific question you would like to ask? And we're back to again. I don't know how this happened, but we're back to again. I can't hear Wendell. And
No.
you guys obviously can, and so can the software.
No.
I don't understand this. Hold on just a moment. Okay, believe it or not, I just found out what the problem appears to be.
Woo.
Both programs want to be active. So if I've got my mouse where the primary program is Audition, after so long, Discord just says, oh, you're not really here.
Huh. That's weird.
That's just weird. Okay, I'm going to have to change how I record the show. I guess I'm going to have to record the show on a separate machine from now on. That's weird. It didn't have this problem last time. I wonder if it's because of this mic. Remember, I'm using the USB mic this time around.
You could just use OBS because it gives you a really good control of all of the audio devices, even though you're not capturing video.
Yeah, I might end up doing that. We might end up switching to OBS next time and see what that does. This is all a great experiment. For those of you just joining us the first time, Wendell and I talked about this earlier. The idea behind the podcast is to give you guys a gaming resource. We're going to bring people in from all across the industry and talk about different things about computer gaming. Because while at Sapphire we make video cards, we want you to buy our video cards. Our goal is to make sure the PC gamer has a great experience. And that's not just the video card. So if we can give you discussion points, ideas to talk about, things to discuss amongst yourselves, or even give you information you didn't have before, that's our goal with this. So let's see what else we've got here. I've always wanted to ask you this question, Wendell. I'm going to ask a more personal question.
Okay.
We got to go back to the Tech Syndicate days with this. Okay. So for those of you that don't recall, Wendell was the guest host of Tech Syndicate. I always got the impression, and it's funny because your last name is Wilson, that you actually preferred the Mr. Wilson approach to doing the videos. Is that true?
Well, you mean where I was just like behind monitors?
You were behind monitors. You were never really the face out front. You were just the voice with the knowledge.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were practical reasons, which is we were doing it remotely and there wasn't really a lot of bandwidth and the capture equipment wasn't great. And so keeping the audio and video in sync over a long period of time, that was a little problematic. But also, I just didn't like video as a format didn't really make a lot of sense to me because who wants to stare at a video of some blowhard talking about stuff? I mean, this just doesn't even. It's like, if we're going to talk about something, let's talk about the hardware. Let's do pictures of the hardware. Let's do B-roll of the hardware. Let's do close-ups of the surface mount things of the hardware. You don't need to see me making funny faces into a camera to have an enjoyable experience. You should just see whatever it is that we're talking about. So it was just like, it doesn't make sense to me to do that. And then it sort of became a thing and it's like, all right, we'll run with that.
Well, that was always my philosophy when we was doing the radio show before I worked for Sapphire. Everybody's like, "Oh, you got to get on YouTube," and evidently I blew it. You got to get on YouTube. You got to get on YouTube. I'm like, no, they just want the information. They don't want to watch my face.
Well, you can use the visuals, the video for like visuals, and props and stuff. I get that, or just like a demonstration or a diagram, but just some random guy talking. It's like that's worthless.
So I'm going to give you a question here that I can't touch, but you can. Thumper is asking, where are all the AMD motherboards? I'd love to hear your opinion on this.
There are actually a lot of AMD motherboards. They're almost all X570. I mean, it depends on. It just depends. I don't know. So it's okay. Well, let's start with Threadripper. So Threadripper, there's kind of a lot of Threadripper boards, and third gen Threadripper is like, if you need a lot of computational horsepower, third gen Threadripper is like a breath of fresh air after like drowning forever. And like first and second gen Threadripper, they were really good, but third gen Threadripper is just like insane. It's like when Nihilum launched, that was the socket 1366, and you get the i7 920, and it's like, wow, this is really good. And then, but it was expensive, and then they sort of refined it, and then like made it awesome, and blah blah blah. And that's like third gen Ryzen. and the Threadripper is like an even more expensive, even more high end version of that. And so I have been surprised that there haven't been any, sort of quote unquote workstation ish Threadripper motherboards. There are a few. Gigabyte has the one that doesn't even have a chipset fan. I think it's the Aorus Extreme TRX 40. It doesn't have a chipset fan. The whole motherboard is basically a giant heatsink. It's got a pretty good PCIe layout, and it's got dual Intel 10 gigabit NICs on board. And it's like, yes, this is a board that is like the class 4 Threadripper. This is really awesome. But there's really not a lot. There's not like 70 different boards. There's not like 20 variations on a theme. And then you step down to like the 3950X or 3900X, or those motherboards. It's like there is actually a pretty good variety of AM4 motherboards there, but they're almost all X570. They almost all have features that probably every man builder is not going to use. Like I would say that most builders that are building even with the 3900X are not necessarily going to use a lot of PCI Express 4 downstream peripherals. I mean, it's really cool that it's there. It's really awesome bragging rights. And then you have the B550 option, but then it took B550 a long time to come out. So we're it feels like we're nearing the end of the cycle, and so there's B550, and then maybe motherboard partners were waiting for B550 because they knew X570. There are a lot of X570 models that are available, but there's not, again, a quote unquote workstation ish class X570. I mean, there is a couple boards from Asus that would fit the bill there, but they don't have, they're more slots, but they don't really have other higher end features like, say, Intel 10 gig NICs on board.
Understood.
So it's really weird.
Interesting question from Borgor, and I think this is a good question. Okay, so with Linux gaming, from a developer point of view, with all the, and I'm going to rephrase your questions, Borgor, and if I haven't got the intent right, post again. With all the emulation now available to make it easier to make the game on one platform like Windows and then run it on multiple platforms, is there really much of a point to porting directly to Linux?
Well, porting directly to Linux, what that means has changed a bit, especially over the last couple of generations. If your game is, if you just dot some I's and cross some T's as you're developing your game, it's about as much effort to quote unquote port your game as quote unquote offer a native binary, because the APIs and the interfaces basically overlap. So it depends on the game, and it depends on the complexity of what you're doing and some of the primitives that are offered. But even like, just look at Wine. Like, Wine is emulating so much of Windows at this point that there are a couple of things that were added to the Linux kernel because they didn't. There were pieces of functionality in Windows that didn't really have a perfectly good Linux analog.
Right.
And emulating them at the kernel layer was much faster than emulating them any other way. And so there are a couple of little bits of code that have been added to the Linux kernel just to help Wine. And, that was pretty cool.
There you go. Question of, he says it's not a real question, but I think it's a good question. Whatever happened to BSD?
BSD's still around. It's not. Or dozens of us, literally. No. FreeBSD is there was BIOS, and
I remember BIOS.
BSD's still there in Mac. But FreeBSD is still around and is quite good and has lots and lots of active development. There is a ton of usage of FreeBSD in the enterprise and in the industry. A lot of Netflix and all of Netflix's stuff, that all runs on FreeBSD, and FreeBSD is insanely fast, low overhead in that context.
Okay, so there you go. So the question about BSD got answered. Let's see here. I can't find where he posted. Soul ST had asked a couple of in the weeds questions. Soul, I'm having issues with moving between Discord and Audition. If you want to repost one or two of the questions, that would be cool, and we can take a look at it. We got about 10 minutes, and we're going to get off of here. I know we're going a little over, but that's because we had about 15 minutes of screwing around with audio. That being said, folks, if you're listening live, if we don't get a recording out this week, we'll get something. but it may not be as good as the last recording was because there's just been some weird audio glitches today. I don't know what happened. Let me see here what else we got. Vulkan, that's a good question. Now, Vulkan is basically a platform agnostic system, right?
Pretty much, more or less.
But haven't we had those before? Wasn't OpenCL agnostic?
Well, it also, I mean, OpenCL was a standard that had different implementations on the platform. That's mostly been fixed now, but yeah, kinda. Um, it's just that nobody really adopted OpenCL. There wasn't really an impetus to adopt OpenCL from like a gaming perspective, the way that there was for Vulkan. So with like 2016, again going back to the whole Valve, Nixon goes to China
Right.
thing. Um, the thing with Valve is that they were looking at they really had done their homework and was like, look, DirectX 11 has a lot of overhead, and we can't make the silicon any faster. We need to do things massively parallel. We had like the way that a frame is rendered, we've got a massive bottleneck in like this one routine that's just doing culling. We really need to be able to parallelize this a lot better, which requires a fundamentally different graphics architecture, because we just can't have hardware that is this dependent synchronization across a certain level of parallelism. And Microsoft just wasn't moving fast enough, and so enter Vulkan. And DirectX 12 is not Vulkan, and Vulkan is not DirectX 12. You can implement Vulkan with DirectX 12, but again, it's not a perfect one-to-one situation. It's still just enough developer headache to be annoying. But if you use Vulkan, because the implementation on Linux is actually quite good, you do actually have less work to do in terms of a port or making things available as you would if you use Vulkan on Windows.
Are we, in your opinion, do you think we're going to see Vulkan become more of a standard on Windows, or are we going to see DirectX adopt more Vulkan-esque technology to allow it to grow better?
It's really the first mover advantage, I think, and this is all just conjecture and opinion.
Right.
A game developer would probably have a more unique insight into this, but I think the reason that Vulkan was adopted is because a lot of developers were already experiencing the pain of DX11, and Microsoft just didn't care. And so, at least that's how it seems. I'm sure it seemed to the developers. And so with Vulkan, it was like, oh, here is something that's being offered that we can use that is a solution to this problem, and we automatically get better performance for our next game. Well, that seems like a no-brainer. We got to do this. And then there's going to be more hardware that supports this more natively with less of a synchronization bottleneck with the older style API. Heck yeah, we got to do that. And it's only just now that we have hardware that's really catching up to the vision of what that API is capable of. So next generation video hardware that's going to be out, end of the year, beginning of next year, is really going to be head and shoulders far away from anything that we could have ever done. Those older DirectX 11 titles are not, if you're playing GTA 5, it's not going to go from 140 FPS to 5,000 FPS like Counter Strike or some of the other things have the way that works. But with Vulkan, you could actually see that. You could see, like Doom. I guess Doom 2016 is capped at like 250 FPS. If you wanted to play Doom 2016 at 1,000 FPS, you could totally do that. But look at Doom Eternal. Look at how optimized it is. I think Doom Eternal rocked the industry with how much crap you could have going on screen at any given time.
It did.
And just how good it is. And this is, can you imagine what they're like? That was being worked on in the time period that we're talking about and is out now. Like, that is the realization of having that kind of a platform to build on. Can you imagine what they're building right now that we're going to see in 2 or 3 years with the Vulkan platform that we have now?
You know what? That brings me to one other thing we'll discuss real quick, and then we'll get off of here. Have you got to watch the Unreal 5 demo?
I did, yes.
Everybody I talk to spends their time talking about what they ran it on. Screw what they ran it on. The feature set that they discussed, and tell me if I got this wrong because I thought it was amazing, It's got a much more advanced physics API built into it. It lets you import basically any graphics you want into the system and then properly optimizes and scales them, and has probably the most advanced lighting system we've seen in quite some time, including, in my opinion, with possibly the exception of reflections, more advanced than the current ray tracing stuff offered.
It does look good. It does look really good. I don't know how much of it is, sort of a cooked demo or like a pre-rendered.
Well, a lot of it's cooked. We know that.
Well, I mean, you never know though, because some of the first mind-blowing stuff with lighting was textures that were animated that had pre-computed lighting. And so it was like, wow, this is really amazing lighting of where this thing is moving, but it was moving through a pre-computed path. And so, yeah, the lighting was changing on the textures of the polygons, but that path and that the effect of the light was pre-computed. And so the demo was live. The demo itself wasn't pre-computed, but the motion of the thing creating the light was pre-computed. And I don't think that this demo is like that. I just prefer to reserve judgment until the the developer kit is available, and it's like, all right, can I have a box of lights? And I shake up the box of lights, and then the lights are all doing really incredible things. And I would say the answer is probably yes, because AMD has acted like RTX didn't really catch them off guard, but that RTX, how that approach is like, oh, that's an interesting approach, ray tracing, but we have this other thing. And if we have this other thing is the thing that we saw in the PS5 demo, and it's going to be available everywhere, then things could get interesting.
Well, to me, the part that excited me was when they were talking about the statue and how they had just imported this ridiculously high polygon count or triangle count statue into the game. They didn't have to redraw it. They didn't have to scale it. They just put it in, and the game engine took care of the rest. That's going to be really, if that's true, if that ability to just import that resolution of detail and then let the game engine do its thing is true, from a developer standpoint, that reduces a ton of overhead work.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And anything that is going to speed development like that is going to be... I like the... did you see the demo where the artist and the programmer were working together in the virtual environment, and it was like a collaboration space, but they were inside the game? It's like, yeah, that's going to speed some game development, because, I mean, if you build the platform, like imagine a Skyrim type game or a GTA 5 type game. Imagine the world that you build where you can just turn the writers and storytellers loose, and they can just props and create the thing, and the writers are just creating the environment as they go. We can have super immersive games like Skyrim that don't take 10 years to develop.
Yeah, that would be cool. Not having to wait forever for our games to come out, and then they're half-assed when they come out because, well, they'd taken forever.
Yeah, it's all about building better tools to build those virtual environments.
All right. Well, everybody, we're gonna get off of here. We're gonna stop the recording and stop the show. Wendell, thank you for taking the time and putting up with all the BS and getting through this. I appreciate it.
All good. No, glad to be here. Anytime.
All right. Wendell Wilson from Level 1 Tech. All right, everyone, we will see you with the next podcast. Have a great weekend. Great weekend. Great weekend. Great weekend. Great weekend. Great weekend. Great weekend.